I mean, this is great timing, isn't it? It comes into force on pretty much day one of the summer holiday.
Well, I think that's to some extent part of the plan here. We know that one of the reasons why Boris Johnson wants to open up over the summer is that there are those natural fire breaks in place. Children are home from school, it's warmer weather. It's sort of the best time that you could possibly plan in a year to open up completely when we know that the risk of transmission from removing those restrictions is higher. It's lowered by those natural sort of fire breaks. But this comes at a time where pressure politically has been building up around bubbles. We know that 640,000 children have been asked to stay at home this week. Now, that's a doubling over the last 2 weeks. So there was an enormous amount of pressure for the government to finally say something about this, because if you're doubling every 2 weeks, it's not long before almost every child in the country will be asked to stay at home. But actually, so interestingly, the Labour Party seemed to support the government on this. The teaching unions, surprisingly, seem to support the government on ending this bubble system. So this bubble system is going to end at step 4. We don't know when step 4 is. It's likely to be on the 19th of July, but that will be announced on Monday.
And have the teachers' unions given any reaction to this yet? What are the, what the schools on the whole think about this policy, or the scrapping of it?
So on bubbles specifically, there's warm words towards that. It was seen as sort of this policy has run its course, and actually by the end of term this summer, it's sort of reviving this for September would be a step too far, I think a lot of people feel. But there are going to be mitigations in place come September as well. Continued weekly testing is going to go on, twice weekly testing that is going to go on right through till the end of September, and upon which date there is a review. There's also going to be some element of test and trace. So whilst bubbles won't be asked to go home, test and trace will be taking on the responsibility for contacting individual children who might be at risk. And also there's an interesting point about children being asked to isolate outside of school settings. From the 16th of August, children who've been in contact with a COVID case will not have to self-isolate. They'll be advised to get a PCR test, but they won't have to self-isolate. And that also applies to 18-year-olds who have turned 18 within the last 4 months.
OK, Tom, stay there for a moment. I just want to bring in, to get his take on the announcement, former Chief Examiner at GCSE and A Level. That's Dr. Tony Breslin. Tony, good to see you. Is this too little too late, or too much too early?
Well, it's a really different balance to strike. Where I think Tom's absolutely right is that there's a level of lockdown fatigue across the system at the moment that I don't think any of us would have wanted bubble schools from September. And I'm glad, actually, that these arrangements seem to be coming into place formally during the break, rather than expecting schools to make a change in the, in the last, what for many will be the last few days of term. So, good that we're going to see the end of bubble schools, but it strikes me that there are various things that I didn't hear all of the announcement, but as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been anything said about children being vaccinated, and there hasn't been anything said about a vaccination guarantee for school staff. Now, we know most will have been, but we shouldn't be leaving that to chance.
What about students who are in exam years at school who have been sent home in bubbles? How has that impacted upon their assessments?
Well, it's clearly had a significant effect on their schooling. I have a son in year 10 and another in year 7 who's self-isolating at the moment, my younger son, because his bubble has been burst, as it were. It's had a dramatic effect, but I don't want to contribute to this negative narrative that these children are perennially kind of damaged by this. These young people have shown remarkable resilience. They've been assessed in new and different ways. Now, I know Mr. Williamson doesn't like some of those new and different ways, but in many ways, they've been more fully assessed than any other group. And we have to look at this whole period as something that we must learn from as we move forward. If we just try and get back to the education system we had, we'll be settling for all of the inequities that were there before COVID, but which were exposed and made much more publicly clear by COVID. And that would be an error. And that's what I talk about in my book, Lessons from Lockdown. We have to take the lessons forward and we have to decide on the COVID keeps. For instance, the use of technology has been transformative. Does it replace the teacher in the room? Of course not. But does it empower that teacher? Absolutely.
But that has also exacerbated the problem, hasn't it? Because those from poorer families having access to that sort of IT equipment has been a massive issue.
You're absolutely right. And those are the issues that what we've seen now is that when children have access to the equipment, we've seen what they can do. Now, certainly in the first lockdown, the government was incredibly slow at getting the equipment out. That's been more successful this time around. But we need to keep hold of that and we need to address the inequities that, used to be swept away as excuses for underachievement. And I think now people really understand that if you live in really difficult circumstances, that is going to impact on your educational success unless we take extra and additional measures. So we have to make sure those children and those families have absolutely top-notch access to the technology. As a developed society, that shouldn't be beyond us, but we need the political will to do that.
What about issues such as masks in classrooms? I mean, should young kids really be wearing face coverings when they're learning? Should they be scrapped, or will it be a necessary measure that we keep in place come September?
My view on this is that we shouldn't be issuing diktats one way or the other. The people who know their schools best are head teachers and the staff who work in them. I'm biased, my wife's a head teacher. But we have to give some autonomy to schools to make the right decision in this respect. But of course, the inconvenience of masks is something we'll all be glad to see the back of. But there is this altruistic thing, isn't there, about masks, that they protect the person you're speaking with more than yourself. And maybe promoting that kind of altruism amongst our young people is not such a bad idea.
Tony, just a quick word about the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson. How do you think he's handled this?
Well, I don't think he's had a great crisis. Let's be honest. It cannot be easy to hold political responsibility in the current environment. But what we've seen right through this crisis is Gavin Williamson issuing statements that he has then had to row back on again and again and again. We saw the exam fiasco last summer, and it wasn't the teacher assessment that created the fiasco. It was the imposition of the algorithm and so forth. And every time, the exams this year, Gavin Williamson was saying until mid-December that they were going to go ahead. Anybody close to the chalk face knew that you can't have fair national exams in the traditional way and local lockdowns and bursting bubbles and all the rest of it. I wish he'd listened to the profession more. He said he trusts us. He needs to listen to us.
It's really good to see you. Tony Breslin, thanks so much for your time.
Now, Tom, I can see you've been sitting there scribbling furiously, so you must have some things that you want to say on this matter.
Yes, well, I suppose I just want to come back quickly on that Gavin Williamson thing, of course, because it is an incredibly difficult job to do. And yes, he hasn't covered himself in glory, but ultimately Scotland experienced exactly the same exam fiasco as England, an entirely devolved matter. And the SNP
two wrongs don't make a right, though, do they?
In the same problem there. But there's some other things that are going on as well today that Gavin Williamson announced that we haven't really touched upon. So, for example, before step 4, head teachers would be in control of contact tracing and reaching out to families and talking to them about cases and asking people to stay home. That's going to be moved away from head teachers and moved towards test and trace, which it might sound like a small change, but might be actually fairly significant. If you're contacted by your school, you're probably more likely to follow that advice than if someone phones you up from the not so good test and trace system that we seem to have.